Thank you. Hi, everybody. Oh, I have an ASL interpreter. Excellent. I'll have to think up something weird to say. Thank you guys for having me. This is my first South by Southwest. I really appreciate the invitation. Thank you. From my hotel room, I was just grateful last night that I could pull my hearing aids out because I was right at the Driscoll where it was quite noisy. It feels like Comic-Con, except there's no superheroes wandering around. So I wanted to talk to you guys today about a particular bailiwick of mine, something I've been noticing more and more. And is the screen up? Does it say art and science? It does. Art and science. I want to talk about art and science, and having been paid to be both an artist and a scientist without having any formal training in either, I think I'm uniquely qualified to discuss them. Art and science. Art and science. Art. Science. Art. Science. Art. Science. Now, the first problem I've been seeing with art and science when I examine them from a cultural standpoint, what they mean to me and what I see they mean to other people, is that they've been drifting apart. And there are three problems with art and science drifting apart. There are three main problems, and I'm going to outline them. The first, is that we see science and art as opposites of each other. We think of art as loosey-goosey, free form, do whatever you want, and we see science as boring facts that you have to memorize. The second problem is that we think that art is oh no, that's still the first problem. Art is the opposite of science. The second problem is that we see both science and art as separate from us. We think of them at either end of this cultural spectrum. At their highest practice, we think they're doing things mystifying over here and mystifying over here. If it's a Venn diagram, it would look like that. The third problem is, once we believe that we can't understand something, we don't even try to understand it. Ignorance does not equal bliss. So let's work backwards through this. Why should we try and understand? I'll ask you a question. Is the world perfect? The answer is nope. How do we get it closer? By understanding what's going on. How do we understand what's going on? One, by paying attention. Two, by talking to each other about it. That conversation is called culture. Some of it is overt, some of it is covert, but it's all part of what makes us a culture. And culture is us. It is simply our reactions to the world and situations around us. If we think that we can opt out of culture, we're idiots. We can choose to be passive or active participants, but being active is better. I've decided that being active is better. Here are some other people that decided that being active in their culture is better. Many of my heroes. Now, moving to the second problem, that we see art and science as separate from us. Let's tackle those two things separately. Art. Now, culturally, we separate art out into a high and a low. We see some as high, some as low, that's just beneath us, some as above us, and in the middle is the stuff we enjoy, which means we don't put much value on the stuff we enjoy. So at the low, you've got gross crafts and silly sweaters, stuff like that. At the high, you've got art that's complicated and you don't want to talk about because it's hard to understand. And in the middle, look, cinema does a great job of riding right across this big band in the middle. We talk about it as a nation, we talk about it as a culture, but even cinema is split between high and low. Also, it's interesting to note how we view artists, and the way we've viewed artists throughout the 20th century is still often how we look at them in the 21st. We see them either as tortured artists, or we see them as gross caricatures of a doofus. And our response to art, when we see art that's difficult, something like a Rothko, or a Pollock, or a Hearst, we say this phrase. Now, this is a big phrase when I was a kid. It's not so much now, but I still think the sentiment holds. We say, I don't know much about art, but I know what I like. Now, I grew up with a fine artist. My father was a painter, and he structured his life. I watched him structure his life in such a way so that he could paint for hours every single day, and through my whole childhood, he painted for 3 or 4 hours every day. He steadfastly refused to talk about his art. It meant something to him. He wanted it to mean something to you, but he understood that those two things were different, and he didn't want to color what it meant to you. But he explained that he thought that I don't know I don't know much about art, but I know what I like is about the most profound statement you could make about art. Art is only what we like. What we like may be based on our experience, our education, or simply our mood or the weather outside, but they are all equally valid responses. There's no wrong response to culture. We are all agents of it. It's often said that there's no such thing as bad art, and that is total bullshit. There's plenty of bad art. The egalitarianism of art, though, is in our response to it. There is no invalid response to art. The only wrong response is the one you borrow from another and when you let someone else tell you what to think. That bears repeating. The only wrong response to art is the one you borrow from another when someone else tells you what to think. Okay, 2, science. We don't think we're qualified to discuss science. Not really. And let's take a look at science news. There's usually 2 different types of stories in science news. One is, some ridiculously complex thing like the Higgs boson that someone tries to boil into 250 words on BuzzFeed. The other is ridiculous technology that'll never happen. Think about you driving here today. Do you want all those people in flying cars? And also the way we look at artists, think about the way we look at scientists. Again, we split them into 2 camps. Either we think of them as grandfatherly bestowers of wisdom on our culture, or we look at them as nerds and geeks that are below us. Every generation that has existed since we've been writing stuff down has thought the same thing about science. They have thought that everything has already been discovered. Now, this is one of my heroes, Richard Feynman. A colleague of his tells a story about going over to Feynman's house for dinner to cook spaghetti. And as they were breaking the spaghetti to put into the boiling water, the colleague noticed that when you break spaghetti strand, it doesn't just break in the middle, that actually a third piece flies out of the middle. And from a material science standpoint, this is actually kind of unique. They never got to spaghetti. They actually ended up breaking every strand of piece of pasta that was in Feynman's house to try and investigate the original cause of what was going on with the material, what was causing it to behave in that way. This is Ellie Lammer. At 12 years old, she is a Berkeley resident who suspected that the parking meters in Berkeley weren't giving the right amount of time. Apparently, the city of Berkeley had been approached about this by a lot of people, and they said it's going to cost us like $200,000 to do a study on it. She did it in a few weeks with a stopwatch. Her work became a published paper which became legislation known as Lammer's Law in California about the regulation of the timers on parking meters. This is Jack Andraka. At 15, he discovered a cheap and efficient way to diagnose several different kinds of cancer and won national science fairs with it. I met him last year at the White House. This is, XKCD. We love XKCD, and he loves Mythbusters, and he has this wonderful dialogue between zombie Richard Feynman and someone complaining about Mythbusters that were entertainment but not science. And zombie Richard Feynman says at the lower left-hand panel, by teaching people to hold their beliefs up to experience, Mythbusters is doing more to drag humanity out of the unscientific darkness than 1,000 lessons in rigor. Show them some love. That's not to toot my own horn. It is a beautiful lesson in exactly what we actually take seriously on Mythbusters. We state, and we will repeat this, we don't stand by our results. We stand by our methodologies. We know that doing one iteration of an experiment isn't really enough, but we like to imagine that our methodologies are rigorous enough, and if they're not, we will go back and retest them. Science is for everybody. Every time you've ever adjusted your behavior, adjusted the punchline of a joke to get a bigger laugh, you're working empirically off of previous knowledge to build something better. That is a scientific approach. The "I don't know much about art, but I know what I like" phrase for science is this: I'm not really a math person. There it is. I'm not really a math person. This is the way people say things like, science goes on in that building, but I don't understand it. It's the way they say, my brain will be taxed by this. I don't know enough facts. I don't remember enough from grade school. I have a friend who's a filmmaker. He's obsessed with filmmaking. He makes a meager living at it, but he edits all the time, like 50 hours a week. He's always making films, and he makes beautiful films. And he says, I'm great at math. I'm just not very good with numbers. And this is a deep understanding about math, because of course he's great at math. An editor has to really understand the algorithms of a story arc, of a beat, of a scene, of an actor's performance, and be able to cut back and forth between those pieces to generate an interesting narrative. That is absolutely a mathematical algorithm, and he deeply is inculcated with it. But when you ask him to balance his checkbook, he's hopeless. And yet he understands that he is a math person. Science is not beyond us to understand. Do you want proof? I bring sports. Now, I live in a world where we have far more sports teams in high schools than we have science fairs, and I'm hoping by the time I'm done, the situation is reversed. But every week, thank you. But every week, every day, we engage in this national dialogue about every sport that we're interested in. And every sport, I have a great respect for sports, even though I don't pay attention to them. These are athletes and geeks and nerds at the pinnacle of their physical ability, utilizing their brains and their bodies to do incredible things. There's tremendous amounts of complex physics and math going on in this, and we have a dialogue about this every single day in this country. There is plenty of active scientific discussion going on in the service of sports. Richard Feynman says, science is the belief in the ignorance of experts. And when it comes to sports, we have no problem in dispensing with all of the experts on television and say, I don't think he's full of crap. I believe that this guy is good. This team is going to be the better team. I believe this is the better driver. I believe this is the better golfer, and here's why. It would be great if we could have that same dialogue about both art and science. Now, the last problem, the idea of science and art are opposites. And this is perhaps the greatest misnomer. And it is so culturally imbued in us to think of science as the death of art. Somehow that the scientific method is the opposite of open-ended creativity. This is an article from just last week. They took an fMRI machine, functional MRI machine, and put a mathematician in it, and they showed him beautiful equations like Euler's identity. And they noticed that the parts of his brain that it lit up were exactly the same parts that were lit up in an artist's brain when he saw a beautiful piece of art. Let's take a look at the scientific method, the supposed opposite of creativity. The first step of the scientific method is come up with a question. Second, form a hypothesis. The third, design an experiment to test that hypothesis. Okay, coming up with a question. How do we come up with a question? Well, in the early days of Mythbusters, we were testing a story. Do you get wetter running or walking in the rain? This is a terrific question. It's a terrific question because everybody understands what it means. You instantly get that. Oh, right, yeah, running or walking in the rain. Cool, totally. But actually, when you start to think about it, it gets more complicated. Because if you run for, let's say, n period of time, let's say 30 minutes, it doesn't matter whether you're running or walking, your clothes won't be able to hold any more water, and you will reach total saturation. So clearly, both graphs end up at the same point at some point. So then we're talking about some arbitrary point before that we're going to test for, and what should that be? Should that be running from one building to the next? Should it be running one city block, running from your car into a building? All of a sudden, the question gets more complicated. And when we were actually writing this story out, there was a lot of argument among our crew, as there is every time we're planning a story, about what we think are the important elements. This discussion is something we believe fervently, each of us taking our stance. I mean, Jamie and I are arguing constantly, and it is an important part of the ethical rigor that Mythbusters has, is that we're always arguing back and forth to figure out what the right answer is. And when we come to the right answer, it's actually really obvious. Okay, the second part of the scientific method, form a hypothesis. So why would this be? Well, it could be because you're giving less time for the rain to land on your head and giving more time for your chest. Well, that's a testable hypothesis. Robert Pirsig points out in Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance that actually the forming of a hypothesis is a self-generating act. That is, the moment you form a hypothesis, you can form another hypothesis, and another one after that, and another one after that. That the more you come up with, the more you can come up with. That is absolutely the definition of a creative act. Now, third, design an experiment to test that hypothesis. This is one of my favorite things to do on the show, is to boil away, take away all the possible variables so I can see one thing really, really clearly. It's genuinely beautiful when you can do it, and you learn so much when you fail at it, which we do all the time. Now, all three of these processes is a deeply creative exercise. Every piece of the scientific method requires creativity and ingenuity and imagination to fulfill it. Okay, now I want to put this back together. Around the turn of the last century, science had come to a tremendous crescendo. Our technology with trains had reached such a point, we had saturated so much of Europe and India. The trains were moving so fast and so precisely, they actually precipitated the need for world time, for a time clock that we could count on all over the world. Until this, Paris was like 2 hours and 18 minutes behind London, and no one knew why. But because the trains were moving so fast, we needed to know. Manifest Destiny, 1909, not our finest moment as a country, but 1909, we declared the United States fully explored. Around the same time, a young patent attorney came up with one of the most important scientific equations in human history. The Wright brothers also invented the airplane. This is all within about a 12-year period. And art responded to this smaller world with more facets. Picasso painted the Demoiselle d'Avignon, the first Cubist painting. He's attempting to break up our view into multiple pieces at once. He's attempting to look at several facets of something at once. This is a direct response to the culture of science that was happening all over the world. Marcel Duchamp responded, also giving his own finger to classic art by calling it nude descending a staircase. Boccioni, unique forms of figures moving through space. Art and science are how we converse about who we are and what we're doing. Since the first caveman picked up a stick, sharpened it, and learned that by putting a point on it, when he jammed that pointed stick with an arrowhead on it, it would tear up the insides of an animal and kill it faster, and thus he could eat bigger game, he was utilizing science. When he came back and told his compadres about it, that he could catch bigger things, how did he tell them? By painting it on the wall with art. Art and science have always been the twin engines pushing us forward as a species. So, I will say, I think, number one, pay attention, take a look around, and eventually you will notice patterns. Number two, participate. And by participate, I mean question absolutely everything. Number three, nothing is beyond your understanding. Seriously. Feynman has this beautiful talk. You should go onto YouTube and look up Richard Feynman talking. Actually, this audience, probably more of you have done it than any other audience I've ever spoken to. But Feynman is asked about magnetism, and he says, he has this great Brooklyn patois, and he says, what can I tell you about magnetism? I can't tell you much about magnetism because I don't understand it in any terms you understand. You need a doctorate in physics to understand magnetism as I understand it, which means, really, because I can't explain it to you, that I don't fully understand it. Culture is conversation. Art and science are how we have that conversation. They make us all better. Thank you. Now, this hashtag #AskAdam is the hashtag for questions. I'm about to do some Q&A up here on stage with my colleague from Tested.com, Norman Chan. Please give him a hand. Oh, sir.
All right, so as Adam said, we're taking questions over Twitter, so use the hashtag #AskAdam.
None of those RFID questions.
And we have someone in the back filtering the questions.
Okay, good.
So we'll be reading out here. Great talk, Adam. I wanted to start off. You started off talking about perception and misconceptions of artists and scientists in mainstream media, in popular culture. Are there misconceptions and perceptions that work the other way around? Do scientists and artists have misconceptions of what the public understands and how they think about scientists?
That's a really good question. I think that artists, because they really understand that they are conversing with the culture, are more versed in a language of their culture, perhaps more than your average scientist is. But I mean, most of the more brilliant people that I know, people like Danny Hillis from Applied Minds, they really do understand that. They do. But actually, I think they might be more conversant in that. But actually, I haven't thought of it until this very second.
You talked about when you're, for example, planning a Mythbusters show, about it being a story.
Yeah.
And I don't know if a lot of people know that that's how you plan out these episodes. You think of them as narratives.
Yes.
in planning out a story, does that ever get in the way of the experiments? And how do those things butt heads with each other?
That's a good question. Yes, according to Jamie Heineman. Yeah, I mean, we are storytellers. We tell a story on television, and the narrative needs all of the rules of an Aristotelian narrative. It needs a beginning, a middle, and end, a hook, a hold, and a payoff. I don't think that the story gets in the way of the experiment, because I think I've learned over the years that the scientific method grids beautifully onto the narrative arc. And that is, every scene follows from its predecessor towards its successor and leads inexorably to it. And when we plot out an episode on Mythbusters, I mean, we do plot them out at the beginning, but we never end up shooting what we've plotted. Things happen that we don't expect on almost every kind of experiment, and then we will alter the narrative to fit that. We will change the story and go to a different location.
And that becomes part of the story.
Absolutely, yeah.
In terms of telling the story, what can scientists do to be better storytellers?
That's really good. You know, I think that the science in our country could talk more about failure. I know that NASA, any NASA scientist will tell you any scientist will tell you failure is the most important part of science. It's where you really learn stuff. But we're also in a culture that's quite hostile to science, and science gets really politicized. And thus, to talk about failure is all of a sudden to court a news story that isn't about the issue, but somehow about how, you're idiots and you guys should be getting it right all the time. So I think that there is absolutely a cultural steering away from talking about failure as a key to science. And that also means that it steers kids away from science because they think it's guys in white lab coats. They think it's like math. They think it's a mountain of facts that needs to be memorized. And any mathematician will tell you, math is this big undiscovered country full of buildings that they have no idea what the inside looks like, and it's a really mystifying and awesome place.
All right, so we have our first question from the audience. It's from Claire. She asks, how do we get people, especially girls who identify themselves as creative, to stop being afraid of math?
Wow, what a great question. Gosh, I have no idea. I mean, one is because I have sons, so I don't have any expertise in getting girls interested in stuff, especially no expertise in getting girls interested in stuff. Oh, that's funny. Yeah, it's a good question. Again, it's about celebrating. I would love to do a TV show about the scientists I meet at NASA and JPL, MIT. These people are all really brilliant, and they have excelled in their field of robotics or rocket technology or aerodynamics. But what you'll find with every single one is that they have really awesome hobbies that often have nothing to do with their discipline. Whether they're drag car racers or horseback riders or something, they put as much into their hobby as they put into their discipline. And when you get them talking about it, it's super fascinating. And again, that's the kind of dialogue I think that lets people know that it's, being an architect isn't just having to memorize tons of figures. It is something that is a creative discipline.
And maybe that's where the fear comes from.
Yeah.
There's a perception that it takes all of your time, it's all consuming.
Absolutely.
But actually these things feed into one another.
Yeah.
So next question is from Tyler. How do you plan on emphasizing science more in schools? Or what are schools not doing enough to emphasize science?
Well, yeah, one of the cultural offshoots of the fact that we don't, it's clear that even our educational system often thinks of science as a bunch of facts to memorize. Because one of the two first things to go in any budget are the arts and the science hands-on experimentation. I'm an honorary lifetime member of the California Science Teachers Association, and every science teacher I've ever met spends a fair bit of their salary on experiments in their classroom. They're self-funding this on a meager salary. And my hats are off to science teachers. I'm terrified of children. And, they're doing the real work in the real trenches. We should, for like $1.50, you can take a blowtorch and you can turn a hacksaw blade from something you can break with your hands into a watch spring. That's a beautiful experiment. We do more of that, more hands-on. You can read all you want about material science, but until you get your hands dirty, until you get your hands on something, you don't fully understand it. And I think that that hands-on experience, the auto shops and the regular shops of our youth, which are rapidly disappearing, needs to come back.
The next question is about the STEM program. If art and science are the twin engines, like you say, why the STEM education emphasis?
Well, it's not STEM, it's STEAM. I add the A for art. Tim Daly told me that one, and then Dean Kamen last night told me that will.i.am came up with STEAM. And I love that. I've been promoting STEAM ever since because they work totally together. And as well, I think that more scientists understand how creative science is than artists do. Every scientist understands how fulfilling and invigorating the process of scientific discovery is. And so to a scientist, you don't need to say STEAM. They just get that. But to everyone else, you definitely need to say STEAM.
Mark asks, if you could bring one scientist and artist together from any time, who would they be? And what would you hope that they'd make together?
Can I just choose Leonardo da Vinci and call it done?
You would pair him and you.
Well, God, I mean, if I can grab anyone from any time, I'd kind of love to take Archimedes and bring him to MIT. Wouldn't that be awesome? Could you imagine what he could actually do with, one scientist and one artist? It would be remarkable to take Da Vinci and put him together with Einstein or Feynman. Actually, specifically Feynman. They would go out drinking together and they'd figure a lot of shit out. And they'd pick up some chicks.
I have a question. As a communicator, you have a lot of avenues to talk to the public. Show, you've done TED Talks, TED Ed Talks, and there are a lot of different mediums. What new medium interests you?
Well, we've been using Tested.com as an incubator over the last couple of years to try all sorts of different things and see what people are interested in. And it's interesting what it's called out. I mean, one of the things we've done that got the most hits was just deep exploration of the most obsessive esoterica in my shop. And I appreciate that's something that resonates. I also really like interviewing really creative people. The show I've been doing on Tested, the Talking Room, the only conversation I'm having is one with really creative people about how you manage a giant creative project. David Chang, how you manage restaurants on 3 continents. Vince Gilligan, how do you maintain story fidelity across 5 and 6 seasons of the best show ever made?
Across all different disciplines.
Across all different disciplines, absolutely. Guillermo del Toro told me, I said, how do you make a movie with like 40 designers and all these people building stuff? He says, you have to give everyone a very totally free rein within a tiny bandwidth. That conversation fascinates me because I think we also think of, how do I put this? We were doing some driving myths last week with a wonderful Formula Drift driver named Conrad Grunwald. And Conrad, like any race car driver, is not only really good at his discipline, but he's also a company. He is also an entity that is Conrad Grunwald Racing, which means they have sponsors, they have meetings, they have commercials, they have a car, they have huge expenses, a team of people moving all around the country. So Conrad's good at 2 different things. He's one of the best in the world at racing, but he's also a businessman, and he's really good at that. My friend Tracy, who owns restaurants in San Francisco, says, I never set out to be a restaurateur, it just turns out that I'm good at it. That twin conversation of being both good at managing a project as well as implementing it, managing and delegating pieces of it, as well as making sure those pieces have a fidelity to your final vision is really difficult. And I'm very fascinated by what that conversation can engender.
The business acumen being a necessary part of...
Yeah, and it's not just business acumen. I think it's management and delegation. I'm going to go bigger than business because even an artist has to be able to delegate Tom Sachs has to delegate to his assistants what to do and how to do it. And one of the things he says is it's really hard to get them to do it terribly. Like he wants this sort of beat up aesthetic, so it's like he has to train them to work shittily.
This question is from Jen. She asks, you've discussed how the scientific process is creative, but would you say the creative process is scientific? And if so, how so?
Yes. when I was really taking sculpture seriously in the early 90s, late 80s and the early 90s, painting something, and still my favorite part of making something, the final weathering, the final bringing it home. And one of the techniques I developed way back then was I'd look at something and I'd think, what color should it be? I did this whole series of kind of twisted robotic arms that looked like they'd been rotting under a bog for 1,000 years. And I had this arm I'd just completed, and it had leaves all over it, and I was like, I don't know what color it should be. I don't know what it should look like. So I thought, well, what if I push it in the opposite, what if I push it in the worst possible direction? Like, what if I do the absolute polar opposite of what I think should happen? So I painted this really complex shape with a candy stripe all the way, swirling all the way around it. And it looked terrible. But that was the point, because the moment I saw the candy stripe, the moment I peeled the tape off, I understood which direction it should go.
You're talking about in art, that's allowed. You feel like you can do that.
Absolutely.
It's not frowned upon.
But again, in science, one of the ways you can form a question is by pushing something to its limit and seeing what happens. It's one of the key ways you learn about what something can do. When I was teaching myself cooking and I was whipping cream for whipped cream, you know, it said wait until there's peaks. Okay, oh, that looks like a peak, great. And then the next question I had was, what's the bandwidth here? So I kept whipping, and 30 seconds later, I had butter. And I was like, oh, okay, so there's my bandwidth. Now I know. You always have to push past the thing in order to understand where your sweet spot is.
It really sounds like you go through the world with a lens of curiosity. And what are the algorithms that are going in your head as you go about your day?
God, I don't know.
What are the questions you're asking yourself as you're whether you're doing something in art or science?
I'm always asking, well, it turns out that, yeah, that when you said in the beginning about being a storyteller is really true. I'm mostly interested in telling stories. Whether it's with art, whether it's with science, whether it's with interviews, whether it's whatever it is that I'm doing, I'm interested in the story arc. I'm deeply addicted to the narrative arc. And so I'm always interested in what story what I'm doing fits into. I've always liked to know the big picture. So, and that story changes. You know, so right now I'm doing all these drawings of a piece that I'm working on, and I haven't done tons of drawings before. And so I'm thinking how these drawings will fit into the final display of this piece, what they will do. That's the main line of inquiry. How does this fit into the bigger picture?
You talked about drawing. It's something we talk about on the podcast, actually. If it's a skill like drawing where you don't have a lot of experience with it, how do you jump in? Like if you're a scientist and you're just doing diagrams.
I start in pencil. I start in pencil and I use a backlight and I cheat and I scan it and I put it into Photoshop. I mean, I use every trick that I can. You know, I always have. The thing for me about the technical execution of something is I'm not an expert at any of the skills I have ever gathered. I'm a serial dilettante, but I know enough of them to achieve a final product that I find satisfying.
Do you ever encounter what Ira Glass calls the gap between what you know is good and what you're capable of?
Well, yes. I also know that like 75% of the way into any project that I'm working on, and this happens every single time, every day, every week, 75% in, I will think, this is total crap and I don't know what I'm doing. Every single time. And this happened last week. And I have to know that I just have to push past that point. I have to keep doing the thing I'm doing. Don't stop. Even though I want to stop, because I'm pretty sure. I mean, when I was working at Industrial Light and Magic, I always thought I was going to get a tap on my shoulder and they'd be like, clearly you don't know what you're doing, please go home.
Do you feel like there's that imposter syndrome, that you feel like you're a fraud?
We all have imposter syndrome.
Yeah. How do you get past that?
Just keep on working. I mean, we all have it. Every creative person at the top of their field will admit to it. And frankly, getting notoriety for what you do only accentuates your feeling of being a fraud. Because you know how stupid you are. You know how lazy you are. How like vain and how much you can give in to. I mean, your momentum is a powerful force, and you know all of that. And so you know, I've been thinking about, there was an amazing Metafilter thread this week on Auden, the poet Auden. And they talked about how he had done a bunch of public speaking early in his life that was specifically for the war effort to get people excited in Britain about fighting for the war. And it put a distaste in his mouth for the rest of his life about jingoism and about, fomenting enthusiasm of crowds and how that, perpetrated your own vainglory. And he's totally right that the better conversation is between you and one other person, not you and a crowd. So I'm always trying to. I try. I don't succeed all the time, but I'm always trying to think about who I'm talking to instead of the who I'm talking to.
All right. Our next question from the audience is: do you think that the immediacy of modern communications has eroded our tolerance for the scientific method as a society?
No, I don't. I mean, I see, yes, that has happened in some places, but there was an article just last week about how, again, this is one article I read on the internet, so who knows if it's true, but the writer was specifically saying that the newsroom at BuzzFeed is taking really seriously that they should get their stories right the first time, instead of just publishing whatever they heard. That's fantastic. That's fantastic. That's new media understanding the oldest lesson from old media by trial and error. And so I think that what could be better? You can't tell a kid not to touch the stove. They have to touch the stove. I think I do see that happening from time to time, but I also see the opposite happening, that more information gets out to more people, and so more people are versed in the important parts of the debate.
In terms of new media and old media, do you think it's okay for new media to go through that process and jump in, or should they go through?
I think it has to, because old media doesn't know what the hell it's doing either. Old media turned down Napster. That's like the stupidest decision of the last 20 years. Everybody's trying to figure out what's going to happen, and yeah, I think new media has to trial and error all the way through it to figure out what the next steps are.
Is it more likely that new media will become old media than old media will become new media?
I'm not sure of that. I think the powerful inertia of the trust that the New York Times brand has is vastly valuable, and probably a lot more valuable than any piece of new media. But again, this is like everyone's still running around with their heads like chickens with their heads cut off, trying to figure out what the hell's going on.
Absolutely. Next question from the audience from Gary. He asks, are you seeing an increase in green or sustainable science and art? And what do you think the future holds for these fields?
Yeah, I think that sustainability is absolutely a deep part of the national conversation now, despite what Fox would have you believe. And I think that's really important. I think that everybody's thinking about it, and it's the right kind of debate. I'm really glad to see that.
What about sustainability and the green movement? Can those facilitate conversations in art and science?
Well, of course they are. Of course they are. Some more of us are. San Francisco is like Prius Town, USA, and that right there is a conversation. That right there is people, and the first Priuses were freaking expensive.
Or at least a good South Park episode.
What's that?
Or at least a good South Park episode.
At least a good South Park episode. Yeah. That, like I said, that's a cultural conversation, and it's a good one.
Ben asks, have your own children attempted experiments that concerned you?
Yes.
And how do you teach them the importance of safety?
Yes. Yes, my kids, I have twin 15-year-old boys. It is like living with one drunk 24-year-old. Drunk, horny 24-year-old with porn on everything that is around them. So yeah, they have attempted experiments. One of my kids got into parkour for a while, which is terrifying. The other broke his femur skateboarding a few years ago. They've come on set. They see what we do, but they're teenagers. They're gonna, again, they got to touch the stove. I can take skateboards away, but that doesn't mean they're not going to skateboard.
And you're not pushing them toward one field or another.
No. I'm trying to do like what my parents did, which is encourage whatever they're interested in. They're both interested in music and performance. One is a very accomplished singer and guitar player, and he's at a performing arts school in San Francisco, and the other is just about to going to high school and is also looking at both acting and music in that.
Next question, something you touched on in the talk. How do you train scientists to appreciate or adapt to art, both high and lowbrow?
You know, I think that, I didn't say this in the talk. I had this longer tangent that was going way off topic, but it's easy to look at a Jackson Pollock and say my kid could do that and it's bullshit and it's not important. But for anybody who's ever stood in front of a Jackson Pollock, that's not a question. Like, they're powerful, impressive, concerning, and upsetting pieces. And, you know, I feel like if you went and saw art in a museum, if you went and saw art in person, you'd understand a lot more about it and a lot more about your own take on it. It's sort of like it's the equivalent of taking stuff apart. If you look at enough stuff, you start to see patterns emerge because you're paying attention. And when you see patterns emerge, you start to be able to call up to your own judgment about something, you know, which is, it's like my early political science hero, Noam Chomsky, says, you know, yeah, I've done all this experimentation, but you shouldn't take my word for it. You should go out and do your own research, count the column inches in the New York Times, and come to your own conclusion.
There's a question here about Jamie. The question simply is, where is Jamie?
Where's Jamie? Jamie's already on a plane on the way back to San Francisco.
He was here last night.
Jamie was here last night. Anyone get to party with Jamie? There we go.
But I want to ask about Jamie and your relationship with Jamie. When did you guys figure out that you guys had a relationship that would be conducive to a narrative, to telling stories?
So Jamie gave me my first job in special effects 21 years ago. And then 11 years ago, he called me up because we were professionally friendly and said, I got a call from Discovery Channel. They want to do this show called Mythbusters. They want to shoot a demo reel. I don't really think that I could do it on my own, but maybe we could do it together. And then we shot the pilots over 6 weeks. They loved it. The camera crew showed up 3 weeks later. Sorry, we shot the demo reel over 6 hours, cut it. The camera crew showed up 3 weeks later. We shot the pilots over 6 weeks, and then Discovery picked them up. And we've been literally shooting Mythbusters ever since. But in January of 2003, when the first episode of Mythbusters aired and the ratings were really good, I found out about it in Jamie's office, and he sat in his desk and he leaned back and he goes, with this sort of evil grin on his face, and he says, you know, I may end up being more important to you than, you know, even the person you end up marrying. I thought he was wrong at that point.
All right, Richard asks, what's the worst or funniest outcome you've seen as a result of being curious?
Funniest outcome. We were testing a myth about a guy who gets so stinking drunk that he realizes he can't drive himself home. So he asks his friend to drive him home, except his friend is legally blind. He figures the ticket for driving legally blind can't be as bad as the DUI. So we tested, can you drive while you're blind? So I blindfolded myself while Jamie sat in the back seat and gave me directions. We were on a closed course. Then we did the reverse, and we were pretty good at it. Then we hired a blind guy to do the driving. First funny surprise, blind guy's a better driver than either of us. Because he has no preconceptions about driving. You tell him turn left, and he just does this until you tell him to stop, and then he stops. He's a perfect receiver of information. So then the next step was to get Jamie drunk. And this is funny. Whenever we get drunk, we get to choose our alcohol. So, you know, on the show, I've usually chosen like a nice 18-year-old single malt. Jamie likes Maker's Mark. So Jamie's like, he chooses Maker's Mark. We Greek out the label, because we have to do that on the show, because we have to pretend the world doesn't exist. We Greek out the label, but of course we don't Greek the distinctive neck, melted wax neck of the bottle. And the Maker's Mark people got really pissed off because Jamie had decided to get drunk while lying in a gutter. Which is also one of these things that it was like, if that had occurred to me, I would have never suggested it to Jamie because he would have been like, no. But then he comes up with it. Like, you can never guess where he's going to come from. So he gets drunk, and he gets in the back seat. The blind guy gets in the front seat. And the most astonishing result happens. The blind guy drives exactly like a drunk person. Like weaving all over the road, going too slow, overcorrecting, stopping, backing up, going forward, backing up, going forward. And we're in the chase car. We're going about 1.5 miles per hour. And we finished this 20-minute run that should have taken 4 minutes, and Jamie gets out and he's like, oh, I thought that went great. That was my favorite.
Christopher here has a really interesting question. You sync art and science so well. What about science and religion? And is there a place for religion or spirituality in that conversation?
There totally is. We don't have to prove religious ideas. They don't require proof. They don't. And frankly, if someone wants to believe in an initial domino ticker who ticks the first domino and sets everything else in motion, I have no quarrel with that because I can't prove or disprove it. It doesn't change anything that I believe, and it doesn't alter any way that I want to behave in the world. That's fine with me. There are plenty of people that believe that on every different discipline. And they get a lot from that. They get a tremendous amount from that, not least of which they get together every Sunday and talk about how awesome things are. We should learn, atheists should do that too. We should get together every Sunday and talk about how awesome shit is. But when a religious belief conflicts with a scientific belief, then it's ludicrous. It becomes ludicrous comedy of errors. You can't simultaneously believe that the world is 6,000 years old and then get in an airplane. It's just not possible. The same thing that allows us to inflate an aluminum bubble and send it at near supersonic speeds through the air, the same process of inquisition and inquiry and experimentation that led to the development of the most amazing thing of airplanes and aerodynamics is exactly the same line of inquiry that led us to understand the billions of years old the Earth and the universe are. And you can't just say, well, no, I disagree. That's not as Neil deGrasse Tyson says, the great thing about facts is that they're true whether or not you believe them.
There's a question here specifically about one of the recent episodes you did. Franklin asked, what was the result of the do you get wetter in the rain if you run or walk experiment?
Well, this is a very scientific answer. We've tested it twice and we've come up with both answers.
Which is perfectly valid.
I will say that I think that the first test that Jamie and I did is more accurate than the one that Cary Grant and Tori did. And just simply because Cary Grant and Tori were doing it in actual rain, which in San Francisco is barely rain. It's like pissing, spitting water. It's not regular. So it's not quantifiable, really. We were creating a steady stream that could be measured. If you spent 10 seconds in it, you'd have 30 grams of water on you. It was very repeatable. And so I'd love to test it again. Absolutely, it's worth testing again. And I think the answer is, it's better to run than to walk. No, wait, it's better to walk than to run.
Are there a lot of instances where you go back in your head, at least, the things that you want to test again and run again?
Yeah, there's a long list. We can't go back and retest everything. We try and go back and retest the really egregious things we got terribly wrong, which is, plenty.
This question's from Amy. She asks, you have a lot of interests and ideas. How do you decide what to focus on and put effort into?
So, you should know, yes, I do have a lot of interests and ideas, and if you follow anything that I'm doing on Tested or out in the world, you know that, yeah, there's a lot of different avenues, and it seems like I get a lot done. Frankly, I beat myself up a lot because I have so many unfinished projects, and just last week I was like, I got to start finishing some of this crap. Because again, I'll get to a stopping point where I've got to order something from a company and I can't find a vendor that'll do it, and I lose interest, and then it sits for like 10 months or 2 years, and that happens repeatedly. So there's two ways in which I keep working on things. One is just whatever I'm interested in. So I'll go into my shop at lunch and I'll just look around and see, like, let me grab that. And sometimes I do a quick project, sometimes I do a long-term project. If I've been away for a while, I'll do a quick one just to kind of get my hands loose, and then I'll jump in. If I can't think of something to do in my shop, I'll do shop infrastructure. I'll rebuild a wood rack, or I'll make a cup holder for my video game console, which I still haven't done yet. I try and keep myself interested in the process. Frankly, you know, I still imagine that I'm pretty poor at it sometimes.
Is it okay to dive into a variety of things and lose interest and then come back later? And,
Obviously, I think so, because that's exactly what happens.
what is a good interval? And
Well, I don't, you know, the interval can be anything from 2 months to like 5 years. I mean, criminy, I have what? I have probably 10 hours of work left on my Blade Runner blaster, and I haven't gotten to it in 3 years. And it's literally sort of an interest combined with a dedication thing that I've just got to bring it to the shop and be like, roll up my sleeves and really attack it. But it got to a point where I felt so in love with it, and I just sort of had it in my office at home for so long that I forgot that there was still work to do on it. The answer is I don't know. The answer is I'm not really sure. You know, I bounce back and forth between all these poles. And also, I have very little extracurricular time. And I try and maximize it, but still, you know, that ends up having a noted effect on my ability to get things done.
how do you find a balance between that extracurricular stuff and family stuff?
The extracurricular stuff and the family stuff is actually one of the areas in which things feel pretty balanced. My shop is about 3 blocks from my house in San Francisco. I'm very lucky in that regard. My wife and I are very active in our kids' lives. And my kids are awesome people. And so there's a real flow between the house and the shop that you know, I used to feel like I was stealing time when I was in my shop. And I think a lot of people do. A lot of DIYers in their garage, in their basement, in their shop feel like they're stealing time away from their family. And I spent a long time thinking that. At some point, my wife pointed out to me that it doesn't matter where you are if your focus is in the right place. And it's really true. It's like if I know where my family is and I know what's going on and I'm part of the process, then it doesn't really matter where my physical body is because I'm part of the process and I'm partnered up with my kids and my wife and my family to take care of all of this stuff. If I am stealing time by stopping paying attention to all that stuff and ignoring it, that's a problem. And it's not a problem that I want because I love my family and I want my kids to grow up happy and healthy and with a dad who is present.
So Mike asks, what can we, the audience, do to influence change right now? Taking in mind who might be in the audience, what fields they might be in.
Yeah.
What would you charge them with?
You know, there's a lot of writing on science. In fact, I mean, you know, I'm a big fan of Edward Snowden, who spoke earlier today here. And he's talking about science, social science, and he's talking about some very complex issues. And we're having a national debate about it for the last year, and it's a really vital and important debate for us to have, and it bears directly on our personal rights, it bears directly on copyright, it bears on art, on science, on everything. And we owe it to ourselves, I owe it to myself, to educate myself about what these things actually mean instead of just reading the headlines on Reddit and thinking that I know a story, which I'm totally guilty of. But in terms of activating real change right now, you know, if there's something that's interesting to you, understand more about it. You know, it's a singular pleasure not to just understand the headline, but to understand the background. My kids are always joking that they'll show up at the dinner table with a bunch of literally like boing boing headlines in their head. And they're like, did you hear about my kid told me that the guy who developed Flappy Bird killed himself. And I was like, no, he didn't. And frankly, that's not the issue. But here, and they're now like, everything we know, Dad knows more about it. Which is great, because it's hard to be omnipotent with 15-year-olds.
But it's okay to be wrong.
It's totally okay to be wrong, as I am all the time.
I think that's all the time we have.
I think that's it.
Thank you so much, Adam.
Thank you so much, guys. I really appreciate it. Thank you.